Hello and welcome to our Dolby Atmos music mixing session. I'm David Ziegler. I'm from Dolby, working here in Germany and responsible for looking after sound studios and sound mixing creatives for Dolby Atmos.
And my name is Eric Horstmann, and I'm the founder of Immersive Lab, where we have specialized on immersive music production, mainly in Dolby Atmos. And we wanted to give you some insights into what is Dolby Atmos for music from the Dolby perspective, and then we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into a session and see how to creatively work in that format. So, David, up to you.
Okay, so before we dive into Eric's Pro Tools sessions and his mixing workflows, I just wanted to explain a few words about Dolby Atmos for music and what this actually means. So we basically thought that Dolby Atmos is a new way for people to mix music, to experience music, and to bring such a format to life, you have to look at all sides of things. So we have to look at the music creation. So this is where we are here. We're talking to creatives, to sound studios, to labels. You have to look at content distribution. You have to make sure that actually the things that the people are mixing are able to be distributed to people. And you have to look at playback devices. So this is also a very important thing, that people at home can actually experience Dolby Atmos. And we are a bit lucky on that regard, because Atmos has been a thing in the home theater, home cinema world for a long time, because of Netflix, Disney+, Hollywood titles. So there are a lot of devices in the world that can actually playback Dolby Atmos, and we can use all of these devices to bring Dolby Atmos music to the people. A bit more of that is actually also can be found in one article here on Production Expert, which can be found with this video, where you can see a bit more about how Atmos actually looks on the consumer side. So I won't dive too much into that here now. So a brief overview. These are actually partners we are working with, labels that have been producing music in Dolby Atmos. It's just a small list. We have actually a lot of independent labels, independent artists that also do music in Atmos. But what is Dolby Atmos actually? So just a few slides. What is actually the difference between Dolby Atmos and traditional sound formats, so like stereo, what you did before? It's basically two things. Dolby Atmos is a 360-degree sound format. You can place sounds all around your audience. We have an overhead component, so Eric will talk a lot about that as well. So there is a possibility to place sound above, and of course also in front, to the sides and behind. You can really choose how to use the room as a three-dimensional tool, which is a completely new way of approaching music mixing. And second point that is also important is we are working with so-called audio objects. So an object basically means you don't really think about physical speakers. Instead, you're thinking about the room as a three-dimensional space, and you're placing these so-called objects in that space. So you give them coordinates. You put them on axis, and you tell them how to move, basically. You give them positions and movements in that room, and then our software, basically our technology, works in the background to make sure that these sounds will be reproduced in those locations where you put them. This is the basic idea. Eric will also talk a bit about these objects and how to use them creatively. You can also give them objects a size, so you can basically expand them to cover a larger area of the room. So just a brief overview about getting started. Again, there are some resources on this very website, so you can actually find pretty good articles on Production Expert, which you can find how to get started, what kind of equipment do you need. In a nutshell, you can continue working with the workstation that you already use, because Dolby Atmos is integrated into all common workstations like Avid Pro Tools, Steinberg, M.E.M.O. It also works with Cubase, Merging Pyramix, Ableton Live, Logic. So you can really continue working with the workstation of your choice. Eric will work with Pro Tools today, but that's not the only one that is possible. The workflow in a nutshell looks like this. You have your workstation and you connect it to our software. So here in the middle, this Dolby Atmos renderer, this is actually the piece of technology that comes from us. It's a little software. You will see it in a moment. It enables you to monitor, to hear in Dolby Atmos. And it also enables you to create master files, which you then need, of course, to distribute your music. Speaking of distribution, there is also one interesting thing. If you're not engaged with one of the bigger labels that directly work with Dolby, you can also distribute your music in Dolby Atmos through AvidPlay. There's again an article where you can find out a bit more information. So it's actually possible for anyone to publish music in Dolby Atmos through this service. Lastly, here is a link to a few more resources. This is a page that we have published. Dolby.com/music/create, which is a landing page where you can find our software, you can find tutorial videos and some more information. So, and now let's get over to Eric and see how this actually works hands-on in the real world in an actual Pro Tools session.
All right, welcome back. This is Eric, and I'd like to give you a little bit of overview about the way how I work with Dolby Atmos for music. And as David already mentioned, there are many workstations that are Dolby Atmos enabled. I'm working in Pro Tools, have some history with Pro Tools, and I mean, at the end of the day, my usual words are the best software is the one that you actually know. So, and I know Pro Tools quite good, so that's why I'm working in Pro Tools, and it works very nicely. And before we go right into the session, one very important housekeeping thing. Please have some headphones ready because we're gonna hear some binaural downmix of that particular song that I was working on. So the renderer that we're gonna show is outputting binaural stereo for your headphones, so you can experience it in 3D. Before we dive in, let's have a very quick look on how to connect my Pro Tools system to the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. That's the one I'm using here, running on the same laptop. It's very straightforward, and I think I'm not talking something new because that has been covered in many different videos on Production Expert as well. Just a quick one. In Pro Tools, in my peripherals, I have a Dolby Atmos part where it can just enable the Dolby Atmos functionality. It's just like a preference. It's really simple. And once this is enabled, Pro Tools is looking in the network for the Dolby Atmos renderer. Once it finds it, it connects it, so we get the green status connection light. That's about it. The way how I've set up the Dolby Atmos Production Suite is a little different here as well. Let me just go to the preferences of my Production Suite. There where we choose the driver, so the way how we feed the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, I have decided to go for the core audio part. I will show that in Pro Tools what that means. But basically in the background there is a core audio driver running, which is called the Dolby Audio Bridge. And the Dolby Audio Bridge allows me to route up to 130 tracks from Pro Tools, like in the box, right into the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. And that's the method I'm using here. So my audio input device is Dolby Audio Bridge in this particular case. And for this particular show today, I'm using the output device. That's just a core audio driver that is sitting right on my machine. And I have the headphone mode enabled. So that means I'm outputting now a binaural downmix right off the renderer. So this is the one that I'm also recording now for this tutorial. That's basically it. Side note, you can actually run also 96 kilohertz sessions. For some musicians, that might be an interesting option. This is something you just tick in this particular box here in the preferences. Okay, let's go back to Pro Tools and have a look how my session setup actually looks like. But maybe, you know what, before we start with that, let's just give it a listen. I'm just gonna play a little song. The artist is called M.E.M.O. M.E.M.O is a Spanish DJ, and he is published and released on Mobilee Records. It's an electronic music label here from Berlin. And I do quite a bit of work with them together on the independent scale. And this song in particular will be released, I don't know when this video is actually coming out, but it's going to be released tomorrow. So it's brand new, it's really fresh. And it's a spherical electronic music piece with a lot of nice vocals flying around. So just give you like 1 minute or 1.5 minutes so to have a quick listen to it.
So what might be interesting, we mentioned before that there are multiple ways that consumers can experience Dolby Atmos music. One way to do this is actually binaural on smartphones. So if you go to the Tidal streaming service and you have the Tidal Hi-Fi subscription and you listen to it on, for example, a Samsung smartphone on your headphones, you will actually hear the binaural representation. So exactly what you heard here, the binaural Dolby Atmos, is available to consumers through Tidal.
Exactly. And the binaural technology and what that means during the Dolby Atmos mix, I'm going to cover at the end of this session. Okay, let's have a quick look on how do I have my session laid out. It's actually pretty straightforward. There's no much rocket science involved. Basically, there's one important thing that needs to be done is there is a little plugin that comes from Dolby, and I always have it on my track 1. It's the LTC generator. And with the LTC, so the timecode generator plugin, that allows me to sync Pro Tools and the Dolby Atmos renderer with this little button up here. So they run in sync and I can actually do on timecode recordings of the particular song. So that is something that I always have in my session. And the output also uses the Dolby Audio Bridge, but I use it on channel, I think it was 129. So beyond all the possible objects, I have my LTC running that connects to the production suite. So, let's just go a little bit through the session if you want. I always have the stereo master file of the particular song if it has been mixed in stereo ahead of the Atmos mix, which is often the case that people mix it in stereo first and then they decide, okay, that might be a nice track. Let's do it in Dolby Atmos. So I always have it here in my session and mute it, but I definitely need this for reference to kind of hear what was the kind of the creative intention by the artist in the beginning of their piece. So I can start to mimic this a little bit or to kind of mix towards this direction. The way how I've structured my session is in the top I have all my kind of maintenance things, my main buses, my playout buses, and then I do have all my processing, so my reverbs and delays and things like that. Before we go to that, let's have first a quick look on the tracks, how I work with all those tracks. Pro Tools and other applications offer folder structure, and I think this is something that is really beneficial for organizing the session, and that just helps me a lot. And for me personally, the colors is also very important, and my content groups have always the same color. So drums are always light blue and basses are always this kind of reddish brown thing, etc., etc. So that's something how I organize it. So when I look in my drum group, for instance, and I bring that up a little bit closer, it starts with a kick drum on the first track as usual. And for this project here for M.E.M.O, I have received all the tracks. They were kind of pre-processed. So EQ and compression has been rendered into the individual stems or into these individual files. And that is way easier than to take this mix and go into the Atmos world rather than having to rebuild the complete mix from default before you can actually do an Atmos. So that is a procedure that works nice, and I think many people are working that way, that you're actually asking for pre-processed stems or individual tracks with EQ and compression and also auto-tune if people are using auto-tune that is already printed into the track, and then you can right away use it for mixing it in Dolby Atmos. Yeah, let's just look into some best practices or things that I often do, not all the time, but very often, is I duplicate the kick track. The reason why I do this is usually everything that is percussive or drums or these kind of things, kick, snare, is coming from your front, left and right channels, which is very important to have the pressure and the focus towards the front, in my personal opinion. But then also when the space gets bigger and also in the studio to feel a little bit more energy in the room, I duplicate the kick track. I put it in the surround, in the rear surround tracks, and I level it down in volume a little bit. So what actually works then is that the kick track comes from all angles towards the listening position with the focus on the front, but still you're not losing the back. Two things that I do on this particular thing, and now it gets already a little bit nerdy, I would say. I'm not using it in the bed. I'm using it as an object for the surrounds. And the reason why I use it as an object is actually the binaural downmix. Because when I take an object later on for the binaural mix, I can decide how far away these objects should be rendered. So I can make the rendering off, or like the distance rendering off. I can have it as near, mid, or far. Now when I put this second kick drum into the bed and I have it on my surrounds or back surround speakers, and I'm not taking care of the binaural render metadata for the back surrounds, the kick might get a little bit too roomy in this particular case and will sound a little bit wet, only for the binaural downmix, not for the Atmos mix on speakers, on discrete channels. So that's why I use it on objects, and on that object I actually turn off the binauralization or the render mode, basically. And what I also do is I do a very little time adjust by a couple of samples, so that also when you do a down mix, that the kick is not kind of phase canceling each other, because it's actually the same content. So that's what I did here. Snaps, claps, hi-hat, snares, all these kind of things will be treated as you would go in a stereo mix, or at least I did it in this particular track. The only thing that I take care of is just a little bit of EQ, but very subtle, because mostly the EQ has already been done if you work the way on projects that I was doing now in this particular case, where you get pre-mixed stems. But I then of course apply additional new reverbs and new space elements to place these sounds into 3D space. And how I do this, I'm gonna show you just in a second. What I'm also doing in my drum buses basically is I apply parallel compression. I mean, everybody knows parallel compression in the stereo world, and we actually do the same thing in Dolby Atmos as well. So what I did here basically is I duplicated my drums sub mix, which is a 7.1.2 bus that accommodates the Dolby Atmos bed. I just duplicated this so it has the same inputs, and then I'm applying some treatment on this one. In this particular case, I'm using quite heavy compression with a Arusa, which is a distressor replica. It sounds really, really nice, and I think for parallel compression that is an excellent tool. What I also do on my parallel compression bus is some real tape saturation to add a little bit distortion here and there, so it actually blends in very nicely into the mix. But same techniques and same best practices as you would apply for a stereo mix, basically. The only difference is that we have to take care of more channels now. It's not only stereo, it's just like 10 channels. And here comes an interesting thing. When you're using universal audio processors from the external DLP unit that I also use in my sessions, and you apply them on a 7.1.2 bus, then it's actually 10 tracks and your DSP is kind of full pretty quickly. So there was lessons learned. So very simple. There's one thing we definitely have to talk about is how to treat the subwoofer channel, so the LFE channel. And what I do for the drum group is I'm using the kick drum and send the kick drum into the LFE channel of this particular bus, of the drums bus that I have here. So far so good. But what I'm doing here, and that is actually a little technique that I learned from my good friend Srijesh, and we are actually both doing the same kind of thing, might have some different color on it, but we take out this drum LFE track on a master track. So this is basically a drum LFE master track, and we're applying here a Pro subharmonic processor. The reason we do this is often down to the physical location of the speakers in the actual reproduction room. So when we have the kick drum on the left and right tracks, and the subwoofer is quite close to it physically, so in the front somewhere next to the left or the right speaker, and we send the exact same signal onto the subwoofer, we might get some phase issues and cancellation things at the listening position. And by applying a Pro subharmonic or any kind of harmonic processor on the LFE track, we can make sure that the signal is actually different in that aspect from a phase perspective, that it doesn't cancel out. So that is something that works pretty nicely. And a very interesting thing here as well, and that's what I'm doing for some of my music tracks, is the Pro subharmonic can be triggered on input MIDI. So basically when the artist or the producer is giving you a MIDI track of the bass line, for instance, of the played bass lines, we can use that MIDI track to trigger the Pro subharmonic synthesizer or the Pro subharmonic processor here to actually follow the harmonic pitch and scale. on this. And this is something that works very nicely. In the film context, it works good, but in music, it works even better because that's where it comes from, basically. So that is actually what I'm doing on the drums. And let me just go back to all my tracks.
Can you play drum solo for a...
Yeah, we could. There's not much going on in this particular track, but I'm gonna move over here. Let's just listen a little bit to it.
Yeah, so here you can actually see how the elements are panned out, the drum elements in the room.
What you can see here on the top, I actually have used the hi-hat and shaker things, and I've just put it upright, so they are out a little bit of the way to kind of spread out the drums a little bit. And here in the back, object 35 and 36, that's like the additional kick drum that I was using that goes in the back. Basically, that's how it works. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, and but you can see here pretty heavy compression on the parallel, but that's good. I mean, I'm not coming from a scientific point of view. I just everything is allowed that sounds good, I would say, and in Atmos it applies even more actually, because there's more space to do things to sound good. Right. So that was just the drums played from this particular group. What have I done? Also, yeah, I did some processing on the snare. But that's just about to kind of get back to the same pressure and same feeling of the stereo track. One side note, the stereo tracks usually get mastered, and they do get mastered. And some of them get pretty heavily mastered. The more electronic music you get, the more heavy the mastering is, because you have to be loud, competition is loud. All good, all fine. In Dolby Atmos, the way how you work with the thing called mastering is a little bit different, actually. You don't necessarily need to master it. There are some boundaries where your mix should fit in terms of loudness and true peak things, but there is no mastering process involved by default. However, what I've done in the last couple of mixes, not for this one, but the ones I'm working on right now, I just re-imported the ADM that I did into Pro Tools, where I have everything kind of finished, mixed, and then I do some mastering processes and multi-band compression, things like that. So there is a workflow for doing it, but it's not necessarily needed, because when you follow the guidelines of the loudness specifications for a Dolby Atmos mix, you won't be too low or too loud when you hear your things on Tidal or Amazon Music Unlimited. So that's because everybody's following the same rules in this particular case. It's not the same in music necessarily.
It's also an important thing that because you have so much more channels to play with, you have less of a pressure to EQ and compress that much, because it's just more physical space for all the elements.
That's correct. That's correct. Way more space. For the bass, I'm doing exactly the same processes and processing in this particular case than I did for the drum group. So it's simple. It's just one bass track that feeds a little bit of LFE, not that much. The most energy is coming on left and right for this one. It goes into my bass 712 bus with a little general compression on it, and then I have also the LFE. I'm using the LFE with a different setup of the Pro Subharmonic in this particular case. And as I said, here in this case, it would be really nice to have the MIDI track of the bass line, because mostly it's used with virtual instruments, so that MIDI could be used then to trigger this, but I didn't have it for this particular session. But when we have a look at the next parts, actually in this song, you heard there are a couple of guitars in there, which is very nice. And don't get irritated that my main bus is still called piano, because that's actually one of the first tracks where electronic music came with some guitars, so it's still labeled from my template. And there I have piano things. So here I did a couple of different things. Basically, I received 2, 3, 4 guitar tracks for this particular thing. The one, you can also see it in the waveform, has been kind of heavily panned to the left, and the other one has been heavily panned to the right. And I actually increased this location even more. So first of all, I have both assigned to become an object. So that makes the placement in 3D space more precise than if you would use the bed. In a speaker environment that I'm using here in my studio, which is a 7.1.4 setup, there's not much difference between using the bed and using an object in terms of localization on the speakers. But with the binaural downmix, you can treat every object individually in terms how it gets rendered into the binaural mix. So that's why I see a big benefit of using it in objects, because just to apply this distance rendering later on for the headphone mix, it's really worth it to have a look at. And because it doesn't make much difference in my studio how it sounds, I can leave it as an object without any problem. There's just one downside with the object, I'm gonna tell you later. So what I did here, basically, I have used this guitar track, I have panned it pretty leftish into the room, and the other one is mainly in the center. And what I did here, I mean, I just experiment, so there's no rules that really apply. I have increased the size of the object that is here left to me, so the left side of the guitar. The size parameter, as David already mentioned, is there for kind of making a little object sound a little bit bigger. So it actually spreads out to the speakers close to it. So it sounds actually bigger than it actually is. And so you get a little bit a diffuse sound of it. It's not so pinpoint accurate in this case. It just adds a little bit of space here. And no LFE, obviously. And the other one is here. That's about it. For the other guitar, I have done exactly more or less the opposite. So I have panned it more to the right and into the right back surrounds. I have lifted it up, so make it a little higher. So we have kind of a falling shape if you just listen only to the guitars. So the right guitar is a little above, the left guitar is a little on your ear height, on the floor height. But I thought it sounds pretty nice. So I've spread it out a little bit, and here I have increased the size on both tracks of this stereo track. But that's about it. There's not much treatment in this here going on in terms of positioning. And those two tracks are kind of static. So I have placed them there because they play nicely together, and it just adds a very big kind of dome around you, a dome full of guitars, more or less. And then there is some guitars that are just playing a little bit of melodies, and I have put them in the back top, more or less, so they play behind you. And actually what the effect is that you're kind of completely surrounded by guitars. Same applies to this track here, and I think I have some movement in there. Let's have a listen. I'm gonna put the guitars on solo. Yeah, there's actually some movement going on. It's not much, but still. And this is how it looks in the renderer. So a little bit of movement on this guitar melody part, not the chords that are progressing throughout the song, in order to give a little bit of room to the whole thing. In terms of processing, pretty simple and usual stuff. Nothing dramatic, spectacular. I've just added a little bit of heights in the 3.5 kilohertz area, which is kind of also down to the fact that I'm not applying mastering the way how we used to do it in stereo. So when you switch over between stereo and the Dolby Atmos mix, you hear which kind of frequency bands you need to kind of push a little bit in order to get the same feeling and sound. And then I have 1176 here, pretty heavy compression actually, but it just makes it a little bit more compact. And as David just said, that we have way more space available now in Dolby Atmos, so things can also kind of get loose at some point if you're not taking care of the compression. So depending on the style, I think some proper compression is definitely nice to have, because otherwise it flies out and it's not so consistent. And what I also have in this group is actually, but I haven't used it in this particular track, I have an Upmix path. So the Upmix path, I regularly use it. Maybe I can show you that on the synth tracks, because there is actually some Upmix happening. So that is my synth group. There's not much stuff going on in this track. It's really, really basic and subtle, but it works very nicely. On the first three synth tracks, I have done exactly the same. So I have used them as objects in order to be able to place them very precisely in 3D space and also have the possibility to take care of the binaural render mode later on for the headphone version. So what I did here, basically it's really simple. So one of the first synth tracks, the top one, I've just put it in the front and lifted it up a little bit. The second synth track is coming a little more into the room to spread it out a little bit, but it's still pretty fronty. Is that a word that exists? I don't know. But it's pretty much focused into the front of the listening position. And then I do have another track that is coming in here that actually moves around a little bit. So that is doing some movements around the audience. If you want, let's just push play on the synth group. Just give a little bit of pre-roll. What I did here with this particular little synth melody track is I have applied the ceiling modes or the height modes. What's it called? Height mode?
Elevation mode.
Elevation mode. There you go. Correct. That's the one. So basically, when you look at these little buttons here, so there are a couple of elevation modes that are in the Dolby Atmos panning structure algorithm. One is called freehand. Freehand means that you do panning of left and right, front and back, and the height axis will be individually engaged. So whenever you want to have something in the height, you just turn up the height button. And then the elevation modes that you could apply is a sphere, a dome, and a ceiling mode in this particular case. But I have done the dome. What does it mean? Whenever I pan an object from the front to the back, it will automatically engage the ceiling speakers. So it does kind of like, it does a movement above the audience, which is in this case very handy. Because if you're happy with the result, you don't have to dial in the height mode individually on your own as a second path or with your third hand on your control surface. So in this case, it is pretty simple actually to make movements above the audience from front to back. And the same applies to the sphere mode, with the difference that with the sphere mode is when I go right in the corner of the room, so completely left and right, it will not use the tops.
Yeah. So basically, as soon as you go away from the walls, it will go to the overhead speakers. So basically, you can
the dome.
The dome mode.
So the dome mode. Yeah, that's the one. So once I go from the walls into the room, into space, it uses the ceiling speakers, and I usually misunderstand. Or
that's the dome, and the other one, the wedge. It's called wedge. Is almost the same, with the difference that basically you don't use the side surround, so you go from the back to the ceiling and then to the front.
Correct. But I think I used the dome mode here in this particular case. Yeah.
It's just a nice little time saver because you can do X and Y and Z axis with one mouse click.
Exactly. Yeah. Or with one iPad touch or whatever control surface you're using. Exactly. And the last synth track I have actually, there's not much going on this. We barely see some waveform. This one I have routed into a Upmix plugin. And all of my stems have an individual Upmix path that I can use. So my vocal Upmix is differently treated than my synth Upmix and my drum Upmix if needed. But in this particular case, my synth Upmix, I'm actually using the Nugent Halo Upmix. And I have, I have engaged a preset, but I tweaked it a little bit. So basically what I usually do is I really like the sound of this Halo Upmix plugin, but sometimes it's a little bit not enough surrounds in the presets. But that's just my taste. So that's really simple. You just engage those rows here that spreads out the sound more into the side and back surrounds. And then with this little buddies down here, you can actually say how much you want to have in the ceiling or not. And one thing I have forgotten that I usually do is actually I remove the LFE path of this group, because if the melodies are too high, if the pitch is too high, there is no content that is really of use that goes into the LFE channel. So if you remove it, you're not muddying down your LFE with things. But that plugin sounds really, really nice, and that's just my go-to Upmix plugin if I need to do upmixes. There are others available as well. I think the Penteo 16 is available. I don't have it, but I heard good things about it. But yeah, but that's the one I'm using. And what I also do on my main synth bus, actually, like on all of the things, is just have a little bit of tape saturation to generate some harmonic, some distortion kind of feeling, basically. But that's about it. And my vocals in this particular track, and then we go to the big stuff, just to be consistent showing the vocals. I do get them also in stereo. And in this particular case, the artist has mixed some reverb elements onto the vocal tracks as well. So I didn't have them in so much detail as I usually would need it. But that was not a big problem. So what I'm using here, I'm using a Avalon treatment with compression and EQ, because I liked how it actually sounded and worked on this particular tracks, and I actually use it on all the vocal tracks for this song, just to give more compression, more consistency, and again, the frequency things, especially in the high mids and the highs, actually are down to the fact to kind of match it to the stereo master as good as possible. Again, you can do whatever you like, as long as it sounds good, it is allowed and it's approved, basically. That's the thing. And the main vocal track that starts in the beginning, I have used them as objects as well, and I have placed them quite far into the room and a little higher, so they kind of spread out in the room. I mean, singing about eternity, so I thought it just makes sense, also from a lyric and vocal point of view, to have it here. And what I'm applying is some special reverb treatment here that I'm going to cover right after the vocals. I can show you right in a minute. So that's an interesting thing. The second vocal is doing exactly the same. Same treatment, same things, just a little bit different of panning. But then when one of the main vocal lines comes in, I have not used them as objects, so I'm routing them down to my vocal stem. And as you can see here with the left and right, I made it actually more narrow, so more centric to the center speaker. Because all of my vocals and most of my elements that I have used in this particular track now have nothing to do with the center speaker. But sometimes it's nice to use it because it's usually sitting in your studio and it has not much to do. And I think it's also a good way of do separation of elements and maybe the chorus versus the verse and bridge, etc. So when you look on a musical part approach, you can actually use 3D space that goes along the different parts in the song very nicely. And what I did is everything is very fluffy, all the vocals are very spherical and flying around, but then when the main vocals comes in, it actually gets centric towards the center in order to kind of also get out the lyrics a little bit more.
I see this a lot on tracks that people use, like jumping between a narrow part and then a very wide part, and then you get this.
Yeah. That's true.
This dynamic of the room, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually really nice to use this when the song allows it. I mean, when the song is kind of has a nice transition between the parts, just use the space for it as well.
I don't fear time. I feel eternal in my mind. I speak my heart. All memories.
So you get an idea what happens with very spacey, reverby vocals, and then it just comes back to the center when the song allows. So that's what I did with this element here. I do have an upmix path for my vocal in my template as well that I haven't used in this particular track. And then what I usually also ask the client is to give me all the effects that I used and were done. So either would be swooshes or whooshes or kind of sound effect elements that are used a lot in modern music production, but also all the reverb tracks, etc. So I have a print, actually a stereo print just of the reverb that they were using, or those 3 reverbs and the delay that they were using. And these ones go mainly just in an Upmix plugin, so it actually already sets the scene more or less by default. But the good thing is you can be creative with this, because you can, if you like the reverb of a particular part, you can also take it out, transform it into an object, move it around. But for this song, because it is very kind of static and spherical, I was using all the reverb returns into an Upmix path and just like lay the ground as an environment. Basically, and most of my sessions look that way. I mean, unless there are very more elements of special sounds, etc. But this is also a usual size of session in terms of number of tracks for an electronic music part. I did a couple of rap stuff and urban German hip-hop stuff where I actually received up to 100 tracks. So that was quite a lot, and it was all pre-processed, but you had to apply a lot of EQ and compression to make it fit the big space that you're actually working in. In this particular case, it is a very straightforward process, and you get to a result very quickly, a very good result very quickly. All right, let's have a quick look on my reverb stuff. So basically, what am I doing in terms of reverb processing and these kind of some specials, some not so specials. I use 4 reverbs, 5 different reverb paths in my template, but I'm also willing to adapt if song allows. But this is usually the way how I start things. So the first 3 tracks that you see here, these 3 are actually 3 times the same reverb. And I have chosen the Pro R from FabFilter. I think it's a very nice sounding, good sounding and very flexible reverb with a decay rate EQ that sounds pretty nice. And what I did is actually, it's 3 times the same plugin, 3 times the same reverb that gets fed from the same aux track, but the main difference is the pre-delay time. So on my first reverb with a short to non-existing pre-delay time, those reverb is going out to front, left and right as an object. Then I have exactly the same, and you can think about how this works out, with a medium-sized pre-delay, and the medium-sized pre-delay, same reverb, goes to the side surrounds, a little bit elevated, and the next one is actually the same reverb going to the back surrounds and with an even longer pre-delay. So the effect actually is that when you increase this reverb on a track, it feels a little bit like something is floating above you or beside you, or it's just like a little bit of wave kind of style and feeling. And I think that works very nicely. And this is one of my defaults that I already always have in my session, more or less. Obviously, I'm tweaking the delay time and things like that, and some of those parameters, and also the pre-delay time, but always following a little bit the principle of having short pre-delay in the front, medium, large, and that actually does a very nice job. That's pretty nice. Then for building a 3D rooms, basically, because what I was using now is just stereo processors, I'm using the stuff from Exponential Audio, Isotope nowadays. Stratus 3D is some very nice plugins you probably have heard of already, or actually are using it. I can't remember of anybody who's not using it. The interesting thing is that you can actually output a 706 path. So, and that's the format that I'm using. So I'm feeding stereo as an input, and I take out 706 from the plugin. And now with the bus structure in Pro Tools, there needs to be done a little workaround to make this work, but this is pretty simple. So on the main track, I have this plugin, and I'm taking the 702 output of this track with the mid-top speakers, basically. And then what I create is 2 additional aux tracks that are fed with an input from the plugin. And in this case, I can choose between top front of this particular plugin or top rear on the next one. And these aux tracks then get routed back into a quad bus that I use with the 4 discrete objects under the ceiling to actually spread it out. So I don't have to use an object for this. So I'm routing this into a quad track. I have it here as well. Let me just show you, then it makes maybe more sense. So here's my main bed bus and my front and back. Front top, rear top, they go into discrete objects and they are fed with a quad bus. So everything that I'm routing onto this quad bus goes into my front and back ceiling speakers. Is that, I hope you can follow me.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, you got it. Okay.
702 plus 4.
Exactly, and those 4 needs to be treated extra in order to kind of have them there where they should go, basically. And I can use the plugin as a track source, so to say. All right, cool. What else do I have? I have a second Stratus with a different approach. So the first that I have is usually like a small room thing, often used for drum elements, percussive elements, a small tiny room, but still in multi-channel, in an Atmos speaker configuration. The next one gets a little bit bigger. It's more a plate approach with some special things, also going out into a 706 output that I'm using back. And then for the big, lush, long stuff, I'm using the Symphony with a reverb time of 4 seconds. That's quite long, but that's just my default that I take for a starting point and then tweak it during the song as we go. And the latest addition to my template is actually the Eventide H3000. I just bought it usually lately, and it was one of the best purchases in a long time. And what I do here, I follow a little bit the same principles than with my stereo reverbs that I showed in the beginning. I have one Eventide kind of send aux that goes out, but I pick it up 3 times in 3 different aux tracks, stereo auxes, and do same kind of stuff with a front, sides, and back as an output. But these 3 Eventides can have total different presets and total different processes on it. So the first one that I have in this particular case is more a reverb with not much echo. The second one has only delays, basically for the side surrounds. And then in the back I have something that is, I forgot what I did in this case, but it has also a mixture of reverb and delay patterns, things going on. But a simple thing, you feed it once, you get 3 different outputs, and then you can start playing around. And the outputs of the Eventides also go into objects. So I can choose where to place them. I can use them individually, and for the downmix, again, can't talk much enough about it with the binaural render mode to make sure that it actually translates also nicely to headphones. Because the majority of people who consume Atmos these days is probably headphones, or still headphones. We'll see. Exactly. So this is basically my reverb echo section that I use. I do have one more thing, and this is also I want to show you, and credit again goes to my friend Shri. He showed me this thing, but I tweaked it a little bit. Something that he showed me, I fell in love with it, and I used it as well. It's the infinite delay. So the way how you have to think about it is basically you just send a delay into one particular output or into one delay that goes to the left channel. And the output of the left channel is feeding the center, and the center is feeding the right, and the right is feeding the sides around, etc., etc. So it's just like a ping pong going around you, and it will only stop when you take down the volume to
minus infinity.
Minus infinity, there you go. Take down the fader completely, because otherwise it will be in a loop. It triggers itself all the time. It's like a little virus going on here. That's basically it. And the output goes into objects as well. So the left output of the delay goes into the left, the center into the center, etc., etc. But the good thing is, because it's objects and it's freely assignable, you can use it wherever you want and just place it randomly. You could even have just an infinite delay under the ceiling, or only in the front quad, kind of like between left and right, and top right, top left, etc. So that gives a lot of freedom and a lot of interesting things. What I usually do in this case is I have those tracks grouped, and when I tweak the delay on one of these tracks, it will also change the parameters on the others. That's basically just a plugin group thing that I did with the Pro Tools group in this case. But yeah, thanks Shri, if you see this, that's a fantastic thing, and I use it quite a bit. Yeah, it has to fit here and there.
We should probably show the binaural metadata window.
Exactly. We have talked a little bit about the binaural metadata things in order to make sure that the binaural downmix sounds the way how you want it to sound, and the rendering of the objects into the binaural downmix works the way how you want it. Therefore, two ways how you could do it. Either you do it in the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. In the window menu, you have something that is called binaural render mode. And in the binaural render mode, it is possible to change these ones according to the distance you want to have rendered. Now, the production suite is giving me a little notice saying that the render settings are controlled remotely. And this is correct because there is a little plugin for Pro Tools. So basically what you see here is all the inputs of your Dolby Atmos Production Suite, like of your main master file that also gets recorded. And here are the binaural settings. Means, let's say my bed track, which is the 712 track. You can see that I have removed the binaural settings for the front, left, center and right tracks. The reason is that when you engage this, and actually I can do this on the fly, you can listen to it now if you want. It just makes it very dry and precise in the front, and that's what I like. Especially when you have electronic drums, things like that are really on point, very high transient stuff. It really makes sense to at least make it to near, but this is definitely something to try out and to see what sounds best. For me, the off works best, basically through all the genres that I'm using. And then I take this on a case-by-case or on an object-by-object discussion, basically. So what I did is, here are the front and back fixed objects that I was using for my quad bus. And the front two ones, I have them rendered as mid, and the rear tops, I have rendered them as far, so even further away than they actually are. And I thought that sounded quite nice. And when we go down, let me just check, where is my... Oh, here, 35, 36, yeah. Exactly. That was my additional kick drum that I showed right in the beginning. And here I have removed the binaural setting and made it to off, so they actually sound more compact in the binaural downmix.
So that's actually the idea of the plugin, is that when you have a Bristol session, you load your session and the settings are there. Alternatively, if you work with another workstation, you just do all those settings in our software, in the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, and then you just export the settings to load them later on again, so you can save them and reload them.
Yeah, but it's a big time saver, this one, and it actually connects to your Dolby Atmos Production Suite here in this little window, so it finds it on the same machine on like an Ethernet connectivity base. But if you have an external renderer unit such as the mastering suite or the RMU, I'm not sure if it doesn't work on the RMU.
No,
but on the mastering, suite, Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite, you will find it via the naming or the IP address. You'll find the renderer, so it can connect to it. But that's the same way how Pro Tools actually is connected.
So all of this is connected through the network, so it looks if it finds a renderer in the same network.
So I think I have told more or less everything about the workflow and the things how I work in this session.
Cool. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.